Well, good morning and welcome to the 33rd Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee meeting for 2019. Item 1 is a decision by the committee to take items 3 to 4 and 5 in private. Are we agreed on that? Thank you. Now, we move to the first particular item on our agenda, item 2 on the Movable Transactions Bill, and if I might introduce our witnesses. First of all, Dr. Andrew Stephen, who is a former Scottish Law Commissioner, Dr. Ross Anderson, Advocate, Professor George Gretton, Emeritus Lord President Reid Professor of Law at the University of Edinburgh and former Scottish Law Commissioner, Bruce Wood, CVO, Consultant at Morton Fraser Solicitors, and Dr. Hamish Patrick, who is the Head of the Financial Sector at Shepherd and Wedderburn Solicitors. So good morning and welcome to all of you. Before we come to questions from other committee members, I would like to just start by asking about the difference that the Movable Transactions Scotland Bill that we have from the Scottish Law Commission would make. I note from the Scottish Law Commission press release on this that it is said that the current Scottish law in the area is badly outdated, unclear and unduly restrictive. It inhibits economic growth by making it harder for entrepreneurs to get the finance they need. So perhaps, I don't know if Professor Gretton, you could say something from the academic point of view explaining why this bill is considered important by the those involved in the field, and then perhaps some of the practitioners might give comment from a practitioner, a practical point of view.
Thank you, Convener. Yesterday, when I was preparing for this meeting, one thing I did was reread the letter that Bruce Wood wrote to the Scotsman last year, about a year ago, in fact, which committee members may or may not have seen. I can pass around a copy, and it puts everything, it says the right things in the right way, and I'm not sure I could summarize it better than Bruce Wood did. Scots law is extraordinarily out of date in this area. And the process has been getting worse and worse as other countries have updated their law. We're badly behind English law. With this measure, we could actually not only catch up, but have even a more advanced system. It's become a bit of an embarrassment. If you speak to foreign lawyers, there's a bit of eye-rolling when you explain to them what Scots law is in this area. Scotland kind of survives with workarounds, so it's sort of we survive, but we shouldn't be just surviving. The Scottish economy needs something a lot better than this. And I would add, I could go on and on, but I would add, this is, I think, not a controversial measure. There might be one or two little things in it that one could discuss, but essentially this is a measure which commands general support. And I'm a little bit surprised that it's not been taken forward so far, especially by a government that's so committed to making Scotland a business-friendly place. I'll mention the term SME, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. This is essentially a pro-SME measure. Okay, I think probably I've said enough by introduction.
Before I come to some of the practitioners, what specifically, can you give us an example of why this is a difficulty, the area in the law in this area?
It is difficult to access finance under the current law. You have to use workarounds, and those workarounds, like all workarounds, are not terribly good. The fact that our law is so backward puts off international finance. International finance has become much more international in recent years. There was a time when I was young when if a business wanted to raise finance, it would raise finance from Scottish institutions. No longer necessarily the case, and there are, Bruce, my colleagues who are in practice will tell you much better than I do how our current law puts off inward investment to Scotland, because finance companies look at Scots law and say, no, we're not touching that.
All right.
So it's about factoring, invoice discounting. It's about security over tangible assets as well. All these things are so much more difficult in Scotland than they are in so many of our competitor economies.
Bruce Wood, you wanted to come in?
Yes, if I come in from the the practical side of things, and I'll split this with Hamish Patrick on my left, because our idea was that I would speak a little bit about the problems faced by asset finance, and I'll explain what that is, and Hamish will talk about the problems faced in invoice finance, and likewise that needs explained. But if I can set the scene as well, following on from what George said, Scots law, as I learnt it when I was a student, and you can tell by my hair that that was a certain amount of time ago, focused, when looking at the security given to lenders, on land and buildings. The standard security, for those of you who are in, is our version of what people tend to refer to as a mortgage. If you look at businesses' balance sheets nowadays, something like 80% across the board is in intellectual property, and our law is simply not fit for raising finance on intellectual property, and Hamish will talk about that. My area that I want to talk about is what I call asset finance. So that is the things a business needs to do its business with. So it's machine tools, it's computer systems, it's truck fleets, it's vans, it's cars, whatever you can, the list goes on and on, you can think about it. Now, you can finance those in Scots law using techniques such as hire purchase and finance leasing. But those are not always appropriate, and they're not always what a borrower, if we can call them that, wants to use to get their asset. They may want something as simple as a loan. Now, we all know you can get a loan secured over land and buildings. That's fine if your business consists of land and buildings, but few do. So if your business consists of a machine tool, and all you want is some money to buy that machine tool, you cannot, under Scots law, get a loan which is secured by way of a fixed security over that machine tool, in the same way as you could get a loan over your house or your factory secured by a fixed security over that house or factory. Now, that leads to various difficulties. First of all, it removes from the commercial area the simplest form of lending imaginable, where what you want is the amount of money required to buy an asset for use in your business. And secondly, I don't want to go into too much detail on this unless you want me to, is there are various areas in Scots law, excuse me, where hire purchase and finance leasing are simply impossible. Now, those are where a business already owns the asset, which it now wants to raise finance on, and the law militates against selling that asset to the finance company and hire purchasing it back, a problem which does not exist in English law. So refinancing an asset that you already own is difficult in Scots law. But the area I want to mention more specifically, because it leads to a very good example, which I think the committee will find very uncomfortable, is what one might call wholesale funding. Now, what I mean by that is this. If you are looking at how an SME typically will get its finance for that machine tool that I'm talking about, that finance typically will come from a financial institution which is not, to put it colloquially, one of the big boys. The big boys are looking at bigger deals than the small machine tool for the small business. So typically how this type of finance is arranged is through what you might call intermediate finance companies. So that is smaller finance companies whose business is financing equipment and assets for SMEs. But in turn, of course, they require to have finance so that they have money to advance to these SMEs. Now, I'm speaking here in a different capacity. I'm a director of an asset finance company, which was set up last year in the west of Scotland. Its only office is in the west of Scotland. All its staff are in the west of Scotland. But we knew when setting up that company that to get finance for it, we would need to, first of all, establish it with a registered office in England, and its registered office is in London. And secondly, that all the agreements we enter into with our customers, wherever they may be, must be written under English law with the jurisdiction, sole jurisdiction of the English courts. Because if it were done under Scots law with a Scottish registered company, we could not get the finance. Now, that is a situation which I think is, to put it at its mildest, most unfortunate for Scotland as a place to do business. But it is the reality that people like Hamish Patrick and myself face every day in life, advising clients who come to us who say, where should I set up my business? And the answer is not always Scotland. And sometimes we just have to be blunt about that and say, I'm sorry, you just can't do it because you won't get the finance. You're better to do it elsewhere. Now, I'm quite happy to go into that in more detail.
Well,
but I think that's enough.
Perhaps we could hear from Dr. Patrick and then come to questions from other committee members, which may develop some of these and bring in our other two witnesses.
I would reinforce Bruce Wood's comments on that he's just made. We routinely tell clients, set up your company in England, have your bank accounts in England, write your contracts under English law, depending on the context, because in many situations, the marginal benefit to be derived from the operation of English law is such that that can tip the balance. Before I go on to invoice discounting, I'll maybe talk about intellectual property. I think Bruce would mention this was 80%, or I think intangible assets are 80% of companies' assets. Over a remarkably short time, over the last about 20 years or so, I think the ratio has flipped around between tangible and intangible assets. Now, I see this whole reform as a sort of mechanical infrastructure reform to deal with how modern Scotland is in a business sense for its operations in the future. There is a lot of discussion at the moment about how we need better transport infrastructure, better technical fibre broadband and many other things to take us forward over the next 20 years to deal with technological change and where the economy is going, where is growth coming. Technology it features very high, and I'm sure it will feature very high in your discussions and various other things. And I see this sort of reform as an infrastructure reform that goes along with these other infrastructure reforms that tips the balance. Why do you come to Scotland? Good education, good people, we're improving technical infrastructure and so forth. We need to improve our regulatory and legal infrastructure as well. And this is the pipework, as it were, that critically improves certain parts of that infrastructure. So I will not be saying to people, go to England. In fact, I'll be saying to people in England, you're better coming here because it works better. It tips the balance. I'm not saying that this. I will always be saying to everyone, you've got to go to England, but it's the sort of thing that can tip the balance. On intellectual property, if you have an early stage company, will nearly always be funded by equity. Just because of the risks involved. That's the nature of the beast in the economy. Once the company grows to a certain stage, it becomes more feasible for it to be financed by secured debt of one sort or another. Now, what assets does it have at that stage? Well, depending on the stage of its development, it may not have a lot of revenue that we can finance in a different way. I'll come on to in a minute. It will have intellectual property, it will have licenses, software licenses, trademarks, registered, unregistered designs, and licenses of them all. Now, at the moment, these assets are very difficult to subject to fixed security to provide that funding. So, if one of these mid-growth, mid-low growth tech companies is coming to me and says, well, I'm based in Dundee or Edinburgh or Glasgow or somewhere like that, and I'm having difficulty getting a loan from the banks using these conventional funding techniques, or it's a little bit too expensive because it's more difficult to do it because I have to transfer my intellectual property to the lender, and then the lender has to give me a license back of that intellectual property. So instead of me just giving him some sort of security right over it, he has to own it, and then he has to give me a license back. Now, you can do it. It's a lot of grief when you have in this sector of the finance market. You've not got a lot of cash around to pay transaction costs. It has to be relatively standardised. So, in some situations, thinking on how the company is going to grow otherwise, is their answer? Well, actually, I'm better just moving to Old Street in London. Because I can finance myself under English law. There are specialist funders, they are able to do that well used to doing it in this way. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that routinely happens, but it's something which when Bruce Wood and I are faced with this sort of client saying, where will I set up or where will I grow? where should I move and what should I do? For these sorts of companies, it will be, well, is it Scotland? Is it Berlin? Is it California? Is it London? And the answer for most of these places is going to be, from this particular perspective, it will be easier for you in these other places. There will be a marginal benefit for you being in these other places or expanding in these other places because of the way the law operates. And I'm not trying to make say that this will happen to everybody, but there are so many other factors affecting business location. But this is like you haven't got fibre broadband. Why would I set up there? It's a bit like that. The sort of thing that might tip the balance.
Right. Thank you.
I'll move on to the invoices afterwards, but if
you want to deal with that very briefly now.
No, I will do as well. Perhaps take my tech growth company. Once it's produced something, it's starting to sell it. What are its assets? Well, its assets are the revenue it receives from its sales. See commercial sales as a business-based one. How is it going to raise working capital to operate its business? Secured credit is cheaper than unsecured credit. People will not provide unsecured credit unless, people very often won't supply unsecured credit for certain types of businesses if they don't have assets that they're easy to get hold of. So what do? You sell your invoices, your debts due from your customers, and so the bank buys them at a discount called invoice discounting. And at the moment, what you have to do again is transfer that. You've got to sit them in a big list. You've got to give notice to your customers that you've done this, or in the alternative, you can jump through some of the hoops Professor Gretton mentioned. You use trusts and all sorts of other mechanisms. Now, this is a very highly used financing technique, both for small businesses and large businesses. And I was indeed sent some documents by a US bank on Friday, who are wanting to move into, who are considering Scotland and a Scottish loan, and they've got this document with every jurisdiction in the world on the back of it. And the only people who were worse than us looking down that list, I think, were Spain and Poland. So it's not impossible that once they've spoken to me, they'll think it's not worth a candle. We can't do this all entirely electronically. We can't upload everything. Therefore, Scotland will be what they call ineligible, which means that they will not fund in Scotland because it's too difficult, too much hassle, or they'll fund at a more expensive rate or whatever. So that's the invoice finance.
And when you say too difficult, too much hassle, what do you mean in terms of lawyers' fees or?
No, it's not. It's what they have to do.
If
and this is the same throughout the invoice finance industry of greater and lesser degrees of sophistication. Everyone's going electronic. What they want to do is upload invoices every day or every other week or something like that. Okay. And what I'm saying to them, and Bruce Wood is saying to them as well, you'll need to sign a bit of paper every time you upload your invoices, probably, or it's going to be a bit risky if you don't sign a bit of paper every time you upload your invoices. I know you've got to list them all, and you might have to give notice to everybody, and we're not sure if you can do that electronically. So with these Americans coming to me, slightly amused at our backwardness, that, you can't just upload everything and it doesn't just work and we've got to sign everything every day. It's that sort of convenience now. Sometimes it works fine, or sometimes they will accept the risk that this may not work because we're not utterly sure how it works. But sometimes they will say, well, it's not worth taking your Scottish invoices. We'll take your French and your German, your US, your English, but we'll not take your Scottish, so we'll give you less money, or we'll give you a higher interest rate in effect for the Scottish ones.
So to put it in very short terms, the bill is meant to modernise that particular aspect of this law.
Yes. I'm going to look at this and say, how would I do this under the new law? And my answer to them will be much, much easier under this new law, much more effective.
All right. I want to come now to questions from Richard Lyle.
Yes, good morning. Your comments actually have quite shocked me. And the reason why I'm shocked is I used to be a credit collection manager with the Royal Bank of Scotland. And so you are seriously suggesting that you can't get finance in Scotland and that everyone has to move to England or move elsewhere? You're seriously suggesting that? That's what you said. That's what you said in the first few minutes.
What I said.
Well, that's what you all said. basically it's hard to get finance in Scotland, so just move. I'm recommending to my clients to move to England.
If you are trading in the type of businesses that we are talking about, you may get finance in Scotland. It may be at a higher rate of interest, maybe 50 bips or 75 bips or something more expensive than it is in England. You may find your sources of finance are circumscribed. There is no doubt that it is made more difficult. If I can give you another example that perhaps brings it very much home, which is production of Scotch whisky. If you are Diageo, you get your money on the international capital markets, and that's absolutely fine. I think we're all aware that there are quite a few start-up distilleries around at the moment. So those are small companies with a bit of equity setting up those distilleries. It is not possible in Scots law to give a creditor a fixed security over your whisky stocks. What you have to do, excuse me, in Scotland, to get round that problem. So this is what we're saying. There are ways round these issues, but they're time-consuming, they're legally expensive, and they tend to lead to more expensive credit. Can I just finish this? What you do with your whisky stocks, if you're dealing with a small company, is you arrange that the whisky is stored in a warehouse which does not belong to the whisky company that is producing it. And it is through the warehouse keeper that the creditor can get his hands as security in the warehouse. Now that's fine, that's a workaround, it works. But it is more expensive because you've got to pay an independent warehouse keeper. You've got to set up the legal system that works it. So we are saying for most of the things we're talking about, Hamish gave a good example of where the workaround is so time-consuming and irritating that people sometimes can't be bothered to do it. We're not saying you can't raise finance in Scotland. What we're saying is you cannot raise finance as quickly and as cheaply and as easily in Scotland on the types of issue we are talking about as you can in England.
Well, basically, there are money markets everywhere in the world, and people deal with money markets all over the world in different time zones and different areas. You also said if you own the machine or the equipment, surely it would be in a building you lease or you own. You know, the machine wouldn't be sitting out in the field, would it?
No, but it's not part of the building. It's just a machine.
Yeah. It's a movable asset.
Yes.
And can be, if not being paid or not on hire purchase or being assigned to someone else, can be repossessed at any time. I know there are a number of questions that people want to ask, and I may come in other, but I have to ask this one. I do apologise if I'm offending anyone. I've never had a businessman who's come to me to suggest this. Is this another way for lawyers to make money?
Can I answer that one? We'll probably make less money, in fact, because what will happen is that after an initial phase under which the funder systems are set up, they will then run without needing to speak to us.
So you wouldn't
at the moment, well, take Bruce Wood's whisky example. At the moment, a whisky funder is going to have to go to external lawyers. Normally to do that sort of whisky financing and sometimes and deal with how you deal with the custodian and all the rest of it. Once you have this system in place, what the funder will do is they will take a very simple document, probably an electronic document, that once sure, Bruce Wood and I will have made a little money telling them how to set up their systems, but once those systems are set up, they will press the button, it will happen, and they won't be coming to us until it potentially goes wrong. So this in no way is a sort of self-serving lawyer's reform. I think Bruce Wood and I have been somewhat altruistic to Andrew and George and spent 8 years of our lives in assisting with our practical comments and in seeking to improve the final result of this. This is quite definitely a benefit for small business and access to finance and modernisation of Scottish legal infrastructure.
Professor Gretton, if you want to
agree with that. The current system in Scotland is lawyer heavy. If you look at systems such as the United States, for example, doing the same thing is lawyer light. So it's actually the other way around.
Dr. Anderson.
Yes, I mean, I would simply agree with what's being said. A businessman there are a number of markets a businessman can get money from. And, as has been suggested, one solution may be to do that with an English company in an English market from an English lender, everything subject to English law and the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts. The point that's being made is to try to make the Scottish legal system fit for purpose. I understand that one of the Scottish Government's aspirations is that it should be one of the best places in the world to do business. What we're trying to do here is to bring Scotland into the 20th century, never mind the 21st century, and to reduce transaction costs so that within this country we're actually able to offer the types of financing techniques that are available elsewhere. The question that was put is that in relation to whether a businessman cares or not, or whether this is an issue for them, presupposes that such a solution is available elsewhere, but it seems to us that there is a major problem with the legal system if it cannot service the needs of its native businesses and businessmen to be able to do it under their own law in their own country. And that is one of the primary purposes of this bill. It is to reduce transaction costs. Dr. Patrick and Mr. Wood can provide advice about where to go elsewhere, and they can provide advice as to how to do things here. But the transaction costs here are higher, and that, it seems to us, is a major problem.
But just to press you on the point that Mr. Lyle asked about, I mean, you're a litigation lawyer. Are there actual real issues that arise for companies that you're aware of because of this current state of the law?
So much of this bill is concerned with what might be termed under the bonnet detail. It's the type of detail that most people in business are uninterested in unless and until something goes wrong. One can use the IT analogy of we don't really care terribly much about coding or all the things that are underneath our devices until they don't work. To take the example, for example, of part one of the bill, which deals with the register of assignations, the major difficulty is a very simple one in relation to assignations, that in order for that to be effective under our law, the governing statute dating from 1862, one needs to give notice or intimation to each individual account debtor if you wish to factor your debts. Now, putting Scotland in the context of just the rest of the UK, that's something that is not required in order for the invoice financer to be secured in England. And more widely within the rest of the EU, if one looks at other small countries of comparable size to Scotland, over the last 20 years there have been extensive reforms to remove these technical and it is thought to be unnecessary requirements. And the problem is Scotland is lagging behind not just the big international systems like the law of England or the law of New York, the European sense, the law of Germany, but to make us competitive with other smaller countries. These are changes of detail that may be uninteresting when things seem to be all fine, but can become very important when things are not going wrong. And the notice requirement in a litigation sense, for example, is one that we can raise all sorts of arguments and increase still further increase further the costs of enforcement, where all sorts of arguments take place as to whether effective notice was given, for example.
Right, I want to a brief follow-up from Gordon MacDonald, and then I want to come to the Deputy Convener for further questions.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just to help me understand what difference this bill will make. At present, if I understand the situation correctly, businesses can raise finance in the form of a loan by having a floating charge over their tangible assets. What practical difference does this bill make, and does it make it easier or harder to obtain those funds?
Dr. Stephen.
Can I answer that one? A floating charge can only be granted by incorporated companies. Right. So many SMEs are not incorporated companies, they're partnerships or sole traders. Right. So a floating charge is limited to companies. Right. Secondly, if a company goes insolvent, a floating charge gives a relatively low priority. It does not give as high a priority as something called a fixed security, which is what my colleagues have been referring to this morning. So the bill would allow fixed security to be granted by businesses, which in general the view is that when a lending institution can take security, interest rates will be lower as a broad proposition, and this will help businesses. But I wonder if I could just say more broadly that by taking this bill forward, it will allow access to finance by businesses to be easier and I think cheaper, because workarounds are expensive. And using lawyers to dream up workarounds is expensive. And towards the end of this project, which was a very long project, which George Gretton started and which I eventually finished, producing 3 volumes, we spoke to the Federation of Small Businesses, and they said, we like this, it's facilitative, it provides extra options for our members. Normally we are fighting government in relation to red tape, in relation to extra regulations that small businesses will have to cope with. We absolutely support this because it gives additional options to finance for companies, which should make getting finance easier.
Okay, thanks very much.
Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could just ask the panel to just explain for my benefit. I really don't understand why the remedy proposed in the bill makes it more likely that businesses will access finance. What's the magic ingredient that's changing anything here? Setting up the 2 registers, the statutory pledge register and the register of assignations, doesn't change anything in terms of ownership of the assets, as I understand it. So what is it about the change, the remedy, that makes it more likely that a company might get finance? Thank you.
Dr. Stephen.
Well, on the security side, on the statutory pledge side, it does change ownership, because the problem at the moment, particularly in relation to intellectual property and shares in a company, is that to take security in Scotland, you've got to transfer them to the bank's name. And this means, as Dr. Patrick has said, you then have to enter into contractual arrangements so that the small business can still use its patent or whatever. Under the new security, the bank would simply have a security right rather than be the title holder of the intellectual property. And that makes a significant difference in terms of the business being able to manage the asset. The bank really only wants the asset if there's default. Similarly, for physical assets, banks don't want to have to store vehicles or computers or equipment. They don't have facilities, but they want to be able to enforce against these assets if the company or business becomes insolvent. So the broad idea of increasing the ease of access to finance is that by making security easier, banks lend with more confidence that if repayment does not happen, they have assets which they can go against. And current Scottish law in relation to this is very, very restrictive. On the assignation side, one of the most typical asset a small business will have is its invoices. And by selling its invoices to a bank, it can get the money immediately and stay afloat. The Federation of Small Businesses in Scotland said to us that around 3,500 small businesses go insolvent in each year because they've not got all the income that's due to them in. Our current law on assignation is, by statute, is 1862. And you have to intimate, and you probably have to use paper and pen, nothing on electronic intimation. It simply means that the law is a bar to raising finance. By implementing the bill, it would make it easier. Banks would lend with easier security, and hopefully that this would have economic effect in terms of access to finance, because security is made easier, and access to finance in the small business case for assignation would mean that the business can sell its invoices and get the money immediately, and banks would be willing more confidently to enter into that sort of transaction.
But could I just please follow up briefly
Yes.
on that? But can't businesses currently put their assets up as security? You know, what's the difference between doing that currently and then setting up this register of statutory pledges to achieve the same effect?
I'm going to answer that in one sentence and pass it to my colleagues. It's a question of ease and avoiding having to use costly workarounds.
Okay.
Shall I come in? There's all sorts of comments I can make to that last remark. Let's take Invoice Finance, for example. I'll move on very quickly, which is by far, it's regarded now in business as a far better method of finance than bank loans or bank overdrafts, because by definition, it keeps pace with the level of your business, because what you're asking finance for is the invoices for work you have actually done for the business you've actually done. So it's not based on historic accounts, for example, as a bank loan would be. The problem we have with it, and which is solved by the bill, is that to take a security or ownership of an invoice as a lender, a funder, whatever you want to call them, at the moment in Scots law, under the 1862 Act, and as Dr. Patrick has announced, you've got to have a signed piece of paper and you've got to give notice to every single individual. Now, if there are thousands of those individuals who change every month, that is simply impracticable. So we have an expensive workaround that is done a wee bit on a wish and a prayer. And the funders know it's on a wee bit of a wish and a prayer, and therefore they react accordingly. It doesn't mean they won't do it. It just means they'll say, well, okay, I've got 90% of my invoices in England and they're secure. I've got 10% of my invoices in Scotland, they're not quite so secure. I'll maybe put a wee bit more safety. I won't advance quite so much money on those, but I'll still do it. So that's one example. If I can come back to the floating charge point, because I think this also ties in here. And remembering before we start on this that floating charges can only be given by companies. So in what we say, we're already disenfranchising unincorporated small businesses. But if we look at incorporated small businesses, yes, they can grant a floating charge. The floating charge typically will be over all their assets. You can take a floating charge over limited assets, but there are legal problems with that, so lenders don't like it and people don't do it by and large. So floating charges over all a company's assets, and it has a lower priority in insolvency. If you take a floating charge over all assets, and what you're doing is financing some invoices, or you're financing My Machine tool, you're immediately in the realm that you've got to have negotiations with the bank, which has a floating charge over all assets, because it's given a loan somewhere over all assets. So that's immediately extra legal cost. Whereas, actually, if you go back to the analogy of a house, or a factory. If somebody wants to if you want to raise money on your house, if you want to buy a house, the mortgage company will take a mortgage over the house. They won't say, Mr. Coffey, that's very nice, but actually we need a security over your whole estate, over absolutely everything we've got. No, they just want the house. The people I'm talking about who want to finance invoices, who want to finance whiskey distilleries, or who want to finance a machine tool, they don't need a security over all their assets. What they want is what, in international legal terms, is called a purchase money security interest. But that means I'm giving you money so that you can buy that machine. And if you can't pay me back, then all I get is that machine, and I sell that machine for best I can get. I don't need to interfere with all your other lending or anything else you're doing in your business. I'm lending you money over a machine, which I think in 5 years' time will be worth X. Over the period of these 5 years, it will depreciate at that. Therefore, the money I give you will depreciate in line with the depreciation of the machine. And if things go wrong, I'll take the machine away. But if things don't go, and if things go fine, I'll never have anything to do with the machine again. It's a much, much simpler system. And it's universally available, except in Scotland, and with one or two other exceptions where things can be more difficult. I have no idea what the Maldives do, for example, or whatever. But in Europe, we are behind. We're behind the money.
Okay, thank you for that.
And the only other thing I might add to Bruce's point in relation to invoice discounting is that many funding institutions these days see that as a potential overdraft alternative for the safety and matching reasons mentioned by Bruce, but also for capital cost reasons for the banks. Under the bank regulatory regimes, they have to hold less capital against an invoice discounting than against an overdraft. So that potentially again feeds into the cost of working capital by using an invoice finance facility as opposed to an overdraft. And there are certainly a number of institutions very much push this as an alternative mainstream working capital tool. Which, of course, is more difficult for the reasons that we've discussed in Scotland.
A brief follow-up from Gordon MacDonald before we come to questions from Andy White. And I should have said at the outset, although I think you're all aware, if you want to come in on a particular subject, just indicate with your hand so I can try and bring you in as appropriate. So Gordon MacDonald and then Andy White.
Again, trying to understand the alternatives to what's proposed in this bill. What's the role of finance leases where somebody can buy the machine tool that you talked about, Mr. Wood? They buy it over a period of years on a finance lease, and at the end of the finance lease, there is the option to buy out that ownership for a small sum. Company I worked for had bought double-deck buses for 20 years on that basis.
That is perfectly true. What you're describing is actually a hire purchase. I don't want to get too much into the detail, but if the debtor has the right to acquire title to the asset at the end of the period, that is hire purchase. With finance leasing, you have a very similar workaround where the funder sells the asset and shares the sale proceeds with the person who has now paid out the full funding cost of the asset in question. So you're quite right. And hire purchase and finance leasing business is a major part of the industry that I'm involved in. But equally, the example I gave you of the company in the west of Scotland, what does it do? It does hire purchase and finance leasing. So its customers are getting hire purchase products, they're getting finance lease products. But for that company to function and make that money available, as I said in my example, it needs money. Now, it needs many millions of pounds worth of money to be able to build up a portfolio of hire purchase assets. For that money to be raised, the funder that makes the money available requires to have security for its advances. And the security for its advances it requires is security over the hire purchase and finance lease agreements, which my company has entered into with the customers you are talking about. So that security is not currently possible under Scots law without giving notice to all the hirers and lessees under the customer hire purchase and finance lease agreements. It's not possible practically to give notice month on month to all these hundreds of potential customers that have agreements with the finance company. And therefore it is not possible under Scots law to give the funder of the intermediate lender security over the assets, which is why they're written under English law. So we're not saying there are no available facilities such as hire purchase and finance lease. There are. What we're saying is there are a lot of areas where finance is required and where finance could perfectly legitimately and reasonably be advanced under Scots law, which our current law prevents. So one of them is that example of the intermediate finance company that needs to raise money so that it can enter into its own agreements with its customers. Another one which I gave you was the refinancing of equipment you already own, because it is very questionable in Scots law, to the extent that it's too questionable for people to do it, for the person who already owns a machine tool, a bus, whatever it is, to sell it to the funder and then hire purchase it back. So you cannot finance, when you're needing a bit of dosh, you can't finance that, you can't get money in Scotland for assets you already own if those assets are in Scotland, because Scots law prevents that. So this is a very simple way round that problem. And at the moment, the way the world is moving at the moment, there is another anecdote I could give you here. which is that there is, because the banks are pulling in their horns a bit because they're worried about Brexit and they're worried about recession, there are a growing number of people in the market looking for refinance on their assets where they can't get money from the banks. And I was speaking to a major funder, one of the big, I have to be careful with what I say, but it's a very big funder, last week, who told me that they have a policy about sale and hire, purchase back and refinancing. And their policy is very simple, they don't do it in Scotland. And they're getting huge demand for this product at the moment as the banks pull in their horns. The bill solves that very simply. You just put your assignation on the register.
Okay.
All right. I think Andy Whiteman and then Dean Lockhart wanted to come in.
Thanks very much, Convener. Thank you very much for coming this morning. This seems to be a pretty elegant solution in the sense, I think one of the earlier speakers, might be Professor Gretton, said that this would put Scotland beyond a number of jurisdictions, because it seems to me, I mean, I'm not sure what the reasoning for that was, but obviously it creates these registers. You can continue to create securities over movable property by giving possession as creditor, and it would remain possible to use intimation. So you've got, you know, for some companies these things might be a bit difficult, for others. So you're creating more flexibility in the system. The Scottish Law Commission has in the past been critical of government for, so the Law Commission does some work, and government just ignores it. There's a number of reports sitting on the shelves from 2001 to 3 that have never been implemented. And so I think, as I understand it, the Law Commission then reached an agreement with government that government would give a response within 6 months as to sort of, thank you very much for your wonderful report, and this is what we intend to do or not to do about it. Now, in this instance, you've been at work on this since 2005, so that's 14 years ago. And I just want to reflect on the fact that in your paper, you say that you had numerous meetings with consultees, including CBI, Companies House, Asset-Based Finance Association, Consumer Credit Trade Association, FSB has already been mentioned. And yet, in the response from the Minister, she basically says that she understands the business sector is very keen to see the legislation move forward, but she says, as you know, it will require new registers. Well, we'll create new registers, that's not a big deal. And we need to consult with business in the financial sector, and we need to work out who in government would take this forward. Now, given that this has been underway for 14 years, do you read that as a sign of an intention to move forward with this soon? Or just some excuses as to why it's all a bit too inconvenient?
I'll just say one thing about the registers. These registers would be expected to be self-financing. They're self-financing. There are similar registration systems in many, many other countries, and they're all self-financing. So the possibility that this would be a drain on the public purse is remote in the extreme. That was just the one point there. As for the rest of your question, I thought perhaps Dr. Stephen would...
The Scottish Government and the civil service have a certain level of resources, and there's a certain amount of legislative time, and therefore taking forward reports of the Scottish Law Commission comes down ultimately to priorities for government. The reasons for setting up the law commissions in the 1960s was to allow the legal systems in England and in Scotland to be taken to be updated in a more efficient way. That the civil service is more focused on the more political priorities of government. So the idea of the law commissions in the broad sense is to do the work which keeps the legal system up to date. As you know, there's the special procedure using the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and that's seen a number of Scottish Law Commission bills go through in recent years, but the rate of implementation is one a year. In broad terms in recent years. The current Scottish Law Commission bill before Parliament is defamation, which I don't think has been introduced yet, but it's in the legislative programme. But the rate of implementation in broad terms has been one a year. There are 5 Scottish Law Commissioners at any one time, and the Scottish Law Commission on average generates more than one report a year. Or to put it more broadly, we have a number of reports we have produced because there are 5 commissioners, but the implementation rate is not as fast as I think many would want to see. The idea of putting projects to the Commission is that the Commission will consult widely and, so far as possible, reach a view which would be acceptable to government of whatever political colour. But ultimately, in terms of government taking forward Scottish Law Commission reports, it's a matter of government priorities.
I'm aware of that, and it seems that the criteria for the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee to take forward a bill would be probably met in the particular circumstances of this bill. It's not criminal law, it doesn't have significant financial implications, it doesn't have human rights, and the government's not planning wider work in this area. I just wanted to reflect on the economic impacts of this. I mean, you've said that this provides more opportunities, it catches up with other jurisdictions where you can do it, and therefore there is an opportunity cost because companies are choosing to operate or to borrow in other jurisdictions and not here. Is there any sense in which we can quantify this? I mean, I know it's a difficult question because it's about kind of things that counterfactuals, if you like. But has any work been done on that?
The report, as you know, is accompanied by a BRIA, a Business Regulatory and Impact Assessment, which has figures on the value of intellectual property, the value of invoice financing, but that is a document which the Commission must prepare for each report and is done in-house. It's not a document we're able to employ economists to work on. So there are figures within that which indicate the values in this area. But in terms of trying to guess figures in terms of the project and the report being implemented, I'm not in a position to give precise figures in terms of...
We're not expecting precise figures, of course, but I mean, you are practitioners.
Well, perhaps I can come in on this. Again, precise figures are quite difficult, but if you look at the volume of invoice finance in the BRIA, and I think a volume was stated for invoice finance in the BRIA by the then ABFA, now part of UK Finance. There is no doubt that the difficulties with invoice finance in Scotland are such that there is an unmet demand. Quantifying the unmet demand, I suspect, is something for the bodies like UK Finance to comment upon, and I would hope that they will do so. Certainly, both Bruce Wood and I have spoken to UK Finance and other lender bodies. In fact, quite recently, in relation to these specific proposals, and they're entirely supportive of them and see the potential. How you quantify what we would have done if it had been a little bit easier compared to, as a marginal gain on the large figure of invoice finance that they are already doing in Scotland as a result of it being easier and cheaper in implementation, is a question for them. And I suppose, as Bruce Wood mentioned, if there are people who are saying, well, we're not doing Scotland for that at the moment, but we would do otherwise, these particular institutions probably have the figures there to say what haven't we done for this reason. If they collect them, and if they're then able to collate them, it's something for the trade bodies to assess, but there's certainly no doubt in my mind that invoice finance is likely to be the early adopter of these reforms. It's likely to spread in a whole series of other directions, and I would have thought that within a pretty short period of introducing reforms, you would have some hard data for Invoice Finance in particular to show what the increased take-up was as a result of that.
If I could come in on that, Hamish. A couple of things. I think, first of all, the confidence we have in the registers being self-financing is driven by what we were told by bodies like the Finance and Leasing Association and the predecessors of UK Finance as to what they thought the demand for this would be. The second example that one can give, although I don't have the exact figures, but I know it for a fact, is that if you look at the billions that are advanced in the UK under Invoice Finance year on year, and it's in the many, many billions. 7, I think. You would expect the amount of finance advanced in Scotland to be, okay, the City of London is finance heavy, so you would expect it to be something less than the 10%-ish of the population that we represent. So maybe 8%, 7 or 8%. It is much less than that. And part of the reason it's much less than that is that many members of UK Finance will not trade in Scotland because of the difficulties. The big boys all do, but they do it aware of the difficulties and taking account of the difficulties and arranging their finance accordingly. The refinancing market that I was talking about in asset finance, I don't have exact figures, but that is worth millions of pounds of advanced money potentially being made in Scotland a year on refinancing of already owned assets, which is not available in the Scottish market at the moment.
Okay, that's very helpful. I mean, as Professor Gretton said, yes, these registers should be self-financing. Of course, the registers of Scotland themselves are self-financing. They don't. So when the Minister talks about incurring expenditure, it's not public expenditure that's being incurred. The concern of the Minister seems to be that the Scottish Government would need to be sure that they would be used. Is there a... and what you're arguing is that you want to bring the law up to date to allow companies to exercise options around finance that currently it's very difficult to do here, and it's very difficult to do here in relationship to other jurisdictions. Prima facie, there's a case for doing it because we're at a disadvantage in that respect. To what extent do we need to be sure they will be used? I mean, this is a matter of passing a law and making options available to businesses.
Well,
just to give a figure, in 2015, the value of invoices assigned by UK businesses was 276 billion. So we're talking large sums here. In terms of the question which the Minister is concerned about, which is would the registers be used, when the Scottish Government policy officials came to see our advisory group about 18 months ago, we went round the table, and in addition to Bruce and Hamish, there are representatives from the major Scottish law firms that do this sort of work, plus a lawyer who is in-house with one of the big banks, and to a man and to a woman, they said we will use these registers. Inevitably, with a bill of this size, there will be differences on detail, but there's unanimity among stakeholders that these registers will be used. We have told, or the Scottish Government officials have heard this directly, and while I have inevitably concerns about whether I've got all the detail right on this, because it's such a big piece of draft legislation, I have no doubts whatsoever that these registers will be used, and will be used to a significant extent.
Okay, thanks very much.
I could just follow up on that. If we go back to the 7 billion of Scottish invoice financing I was talking about, all of that business would be done under the new register, because of the difficulties these people are already coping with and have decided to get on with. So they do it, but they do it on the workarounds that we've been talking about. With the new register, they've all said, that's fine, this is perfect, we will just use the new register. So all of that business will go through the new register. So that's one of the reasons we can be so confident that it will be used.
Okay, thanks.
Right. Dean Lockhart and then Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks very much for the panel for appearing before the committee this morning. Let me first declare my interest as a member of the Law Society of England and Wales. It sounds to me like there are a number of good reasons to make this change to modernise the security system in Scotland, and for me it does sound like a priority. The example of other European countries who have made the change in recent years was given. If we look at those countries, are there any potential downsides or unintended consequences arising from these changes? And a related question, how long will it take the marketplace to adjust to the new system? How long will that transition period take place?
Well, I don't want to sound like a vacuum cleaner salesman, but I struggle to see downside. The proposed legislation is very much in line with modern international norms. I mean, the variations of detail, Australia, not quite the same, New Zealand, not quite the same, Canada, not quite the same. There are lots of variations, but the broad thrust of it is very much modern international norms. And if you look at these other countries, you'll find it very hard to find anyone who is critical of these new systems. So, yeah, Purcell, Warships, Whiter. I don't really see a downside here.
And in terms of take-up, I think, as Bruce Wood mentioned, the invoice financiers will be straight in there, day one, early adopters. They'll be able to jettison these Scottish workarounds they have to do and put all of their existing stuff through it, and the scope for the new opportunities is there. Who comes next is an interesting question. The asset finance industry in the situation Bruce Wood is talking about, where it's actually very difficult to do it in Scotland now, I think they will be straight into it as well. The mainstream asset finance industry may be slightly slower because they're used to operating with leases, and they're operating throughout the UK and internationally with leases. So it may be that it won't be that the entire asset finance industry in Scotland is transformed overnight. That's not going to happen, but the probability is that there will be more gradual change there. In corporate lending to high IP intangible property companies, it will be used in those more specialist sectors. Will it gradually be used by everybody in mainstream lending? It's not impossible in due course. There's obviously the inertia of people with their systems, and I should say that one thing that I have kept a very firm eye on throughout this whole process is to ensure that we do not create something that jars on a UK-wide basis, because most of these businesses operate on a UK-wide basis, the funding businesses and the borrowers as well. And if you create something which jars with England operationally, that is a very difficult thing for them to introduce. I should say here that there's a possibility of, you might say, leapfrogging England. At the moment, there are parallel discussions going on in England about updating their system. As I say to them, our system needs updated because it's rubbish, and their system needs updated because it's too clever by half. You can do all of this in England, but it's really complicated. So, and in fact, I was at a seminar 2 weeks ago at UCL, where the various English parties were discussing how they may take this forward, and their core changes to English law and the problems in English law actually look not a million miles away. I said to them, here's a oven ready version, I think is the term that you could be using here. So that in terms of the businesses, the lenders, you have to look at the way that businesses operate. But I think there will be initial take-up, high take-up with some, and gradually various other people will take it up. And overall, I think it will be its optionality will mean that people can carry on doing what they want to do in some circumstances.
Yes, please.
Just add a very brief footnote. It is purely facilitative. So if businesses and financiers want to keep on using their current systems, including their current workarounds, they're completely free to do so. This doesn't ban anything. It puts extra options into place. Sorry.
Yeah. And just one point from my part, there are certain aspects of the bill that will not just be facilitative in terms of providing an extra option. They're providing an extra option where at the moment there's really no practical option. Shares and intellectual property rights at the moment are perhaps the best example. So at the moment one can't really take an effective security over shares that's practical. One doesn't want to create the company in which the shares are being held as a subsidiary of the bank. So in terms of what this bill will provide, it's very difficult to see why it would not be used, because at the moment there isn't really a practical option.
Can I just give another metaphor? In England, there is dissensus about the extent to which English law should be reformed. So not everyone agrees about the level to which English law should be reformed. A leading figure who favours more fundamental reform, when told that the current law generally works, replied, yes, steam trains still work. Now, if the English law here is a steam train, the Scottish law is a steam train with several carriages missing.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful analogy. Thank you very much.
May I just check something with Professor Gretton? You said that this would not ban anything, the bill. Does it affect agricultural charges? Are they not affected by the bill? And they are, in fact, still used by some?
Middle stump, convener. Yes. Agricultural charges under the Agricultural Charges Scotland Act 1929, I think it's the right year, would disappear. It's no official figures currently exist for the uptake of those, but as far as I'm aware, that they're virtually unused, possibly even not used at all. But Dr. Stephen may have more information about that. But yes, okay.
Dr. Stephen.
We spoke specifically to the Agricultural Cooperatives Association about this because I wanted to check that my predecessor had perhaps not been too ambitious in suggesting that these go. And the answer we got from the Agricultural Cooperatives Association was that agricultural cooperatives can grant floating charges. So under what's now, I think, the Community and Cooperative Association Act, I think it's 2014, but there's predecessor legislation, they can grant floating charges. And an agricultural charge is effectively a floating charge for agricultural cooperatives. So the evidence we got from them was we don't use them, we use floating charges. And under the bill, floating charges would remain.
Yeah, so I think the point is then that floating charges normally are just used by companies, but in terms of agricultural law in Scotland, that's a very specific area of law.
Yeah.
But is there any reason they couldn't be left in existence? You just delete that part of the bill, for example?
It's a very short version that could be deleted, but floating charges can be granted by LLPs and by building societies and one or two other corporations in addition to companies.
Yes, but we're then getting into some technicalities. I just wanted to check on that one point.
But the evidence on that was that it would be okay because of the floating charge.
All right, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to explore a couple of points that we've actually spoken about already, but I'd like to take from a different angle. The Scottish Government said that more consultation is needed in order to ensure there is a demand for the proposals in the bill. And listening to what's been stated today, I've had no hard figures or indications other than the assertion that the demand is there. So, do you agree that there's more consultation needed?
Well, and we think we've done all the consultation that actually can be done in the bits as far as we can see. We've spoken to UK Finance, we've spoken to the Federation of Small Businesses, we've spoken to the Law Society of Scotland, we've spoken to the Consumer Credit Trade Association, we've spoken to the Finance and Leasing Association, and we've spoken to the banks. They are the people who have the principal interest in this. We've also spoken to chartered accountants, and we've consulted widely. We have reported on the consultation we have done. I don't think it's for us to second-guess the Scottish Government as to what politically they believe further consultation is required, but I suspect we think we've done all the consultation that is actually required, but the politics of this are beyond us. Andrew, is that a fair comment?
Yes, I agree with that. It seemed to be that there is a particular concern in government about setting up new registers and the expense that costs, and the concern that new registers would not be used. But we have addressed this already, I think, this morning, and we're entirely confident the registers would be used. So I understand that this is something the Scottish Government officials are doing work on at the moment to check that what the Scottish Law Commission has said in terms of setting up new registers and the fact these registers would be used is true. But as I said previously, all the evidence given to me is that these registers are very much desired on the assignation side. One simple electronic registration would replace thousands of sending letters to the post notifying, and on the asset finance side it would mean that you create security over a physical asset without handing it over, or an intangible asset without giving title. And all the evidence we have received as the registers would be used. In terms of the economic benefit to come, that is more difficult to try and ascertain. But internationally, there is no doubt evidence that where you modernise your secure transactions law, the economy of a country will improve as a result of that. There is evidence of that, which is referred to in the report. UNCITRAL, which is the United Nations commercial law body, has said that. And one of its aims is to modernise secure transactions laws throughout the world. In Africa, there are numerous African countries, including Malawi, have modernised their law in recent years. It is internationally accepted that a modern mobile transactions law is of economic benefit.
Clearly there's a cost to the government in doing this. I mean, there's public money going to have to be spent on a technology solution. I very much doubt they're necessarily off the shelf and may have to be constructed. So it would seem reasonable that the Scottish Government does follow a consultation path in order to ensure that the public purse is being spent in the right way. Have you in any way costed this?
The ballpark figures from Registers of Scotland for each register is £500,000. But I understand that the new Land Reform Act registers, which so far have had a variable amount of use, are in the same amount. So in other words, the Registers of Scotland have recent experience of setting up registers. But as we said earlier, it is entirely accepted that the registers would have to be self-funding, and there will be the start-up costs and the running costs, and that cannot be paid by the taxpayer. It's got to be paid by the registration dues. But the evidence, I think, in New Zealand was that when the register was set up 20 years ago in round figures, it was paid for within about 6 months I would need to check my report, but it was paid for in a relatively short period. The scheme we are proposing is less extensive than the New Zealand one. We wanted to be facilitative, so we did not want to have a dramatic overhaul, which, as Dr. Patrick has said, would cause difficulties in terms of the relationship with companies working on a UK basis. But the evidence internationally is that the costs of setting up such registers and the running costs will be met entirely by the registration dues and also by the searching dues. People will search the register to check if you're taking security over an asset that it's not already been given in security to someone else. So the income the registers get is from registering the security or assignation in the first place and searching of that register. And as Bruce Wood will confirm and Hamish Patrick, the likelihood is that when the new registers come in to operation, which I hope they will, there will be an initial surge because existing transactions will be put on. Is that correct?
I mean, I think that £500,000 doesn't seem much for an IT project from what I've seen in the public sector, but hopefully it is closer to that. Let me just touch on something else that Dr. Patrick's brought up a couple of times, and this is in connection with what I used to call forfeiting. Obviously that's a reserved matter as such. I'm interested in exploring where there's a crossover between reserved matters and where it's within the jurisdiction of the Scottish Government, and whether anything needs to be done to make these join up.
It's probably more one for Dr. Stephen than me, but I think the project was put together with a view to it being capable of implementation by the Scottish Parliament alone. So therefore, while one might have addressed in it issues such as floating charge preferences or something like that, as part of the project altogether, that was reserved. And while one might have done broader things on intellectual property, for example, that is reserved. So maybe pass on to Andrew.
Can you explain what you mean by forfeiting?
Simply discounting of invoices. So if a company has a certain value of invoices, they would sell the value of that forward before they're actually collected. It's a way of raising funds.
Yeah, I don't see any reserved.
Used to be called factoring, I think.
Yeah, but
She's been talking about.
This area is not reserved to the Westminster Parliament. That's just to say what you've just described.
Forfeiting is not reserved?
No.
I'm surprised. You're the expert.
There is a type of forfeiting used for commercial paper, such as bills of exchange and promissory notes. That is a category within that, but this whole project doesn't touch commercial paper, bills of exchange, drafts, promissory notes. But maybe that's not the type of forfeiting you're talking about.
Let me just be sure on this, because if, for example, a company decides to raise money by discounting its invoices and receiving payment for that, is that a reserved matter or not? No. Not a reserved matter. Interesting.
That is what Hamish has been talking about.
The Scottish Parliament has power to deal with rights in assets under Scots law. It's a simple private law point. That's full square within what the Parliament. Just as you can deal with Scottish land, you can deal with Scottish debts. There's no issue around it at all.
If I may come in, part 1 of the bill deals with the Register of Assignations. The whole law of assignation is part of Scottish private law, as set out in the Scotland Act.
The areas which are reserved are set out in Chapter 1 of the report. Intellectual property, as previously mentioned, is probably one of the most important ones, but all the report is doing is facilitating security of intellectual property. It's not changing intellectual property law. And there are 1 or 2 other areas, or 3 or 4 other areas, like financial markets, but they are on the edges of the report and has and as has been said, there was a deliberate approach which the Scottish Law Commission took, which is to keep within Holyrood's competence, because there's a long history, sadly, of a lack of speed in terms of commercial law reform for Scottish law from Westminster.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald had some further questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. We've talked a lot this morning about the impact of this legislation could have on businesses, but obviously this legislation will apply to sole traders and it will also apply to individuals. Now, you know, next to somebody's home or their business premises, the next biggest assets in many cases is their vehicles that they have. And one form of lending that is applicable down south is logbook loans. And I was interested that when you listed the consultees that you've had in relation to this legislation, you never talked about the debt advice sector. And what they had to say about logbook loans was, this is a form of high-cost lending that has been a source of considerable problems for vulnerable borrowers and innocent vehicle purchasers. The advice sector has repeatedly raised concerns about consumer harm arising from this type of lending. And they go on to raise 6 issues that should be looked at. So they said that the 6 areas where the Financial Services Authority should intervene is proper affordability checks, a price cap for very high interest rates, adequate explanations, adequate information on the cost of borrowing, action in relation to default charges, and protection of borrowers in debt in relation to forbearance and poor debt collection activities by lenders. So my question basically is, what protections are in place for consumers and are they adequate?
It was left to me to speak about consumers, since I deal a lot in the consumer credit area, although sometimes I wish I didn't. I think we need to look at this again in the context of what it is we are facilitating. And an analogy, before I get into this, would be with insolvency law. We are suggesting that fixed securities, as opposed to floating charges, should be possible in Scots law over various types of asset. We are not amending insolvency law, which is reserved. Insolvency law tells you what you get once you've got one of these things. It doesn't dictate what it is you can take. Now, the same analogy applies here, that there are 2 quite different issues. One is, what type of charge or security can a consumer give to raise money? And the other one is, how should that process be regulated so that the consumer, especially the vulnerable consumer, is not treated unfairly? All we are trying to do is set up a system whereby that consumer can grant a security over an asset which he wishes to acquire. It will be for the FCA, as it currently does with logbook loans, although I could argue that it's been very slow in doing so, it's managed to put out of business 2 of the biggest high-cost credit lenders. It's done very little so far, and it is now addressing the subject of what to do with logbook loans. So I'll give you some examples in a minute, but let me say one thing first, which is something that I think we need to be clear about. The primary purpose of this legislation, as we see it, is to make Scotland a fit place to do business. Therefore, as far as the Scottish Law Commission is concerned, as far as everybody around this table is concerned, there is a crying need to bring Scotland into the 21st century as a suitable place to do business in this regard. If, therefore, the political consequence is that consumers are felt to be too hot to handle, while we would regret that, that is certainly something that we would be happy to accommodate, because it is for business that this is vital. And that includes sole traders who come into this as well. But let me carry on. Why did we include consumers?
Can I just clarify what you mean by happy to accommodate?
Well,
what do you mean by that?
What I mean is, what is needed is this reform for business lending. We think it should extend to consumers, but if politically the government is only happy to accommodate reform for business, we can live with that. Is that a fair way of putting it? Because it's business that is vital here.
So do you mean taking the bits out of the bill that relate to
consumer lending,
individual
yes,
consumer lending and restricting it to business lending?
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Correct.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify
yes,
that.
But can I carry on with this as to why we included consumers in it?
We are slightly limited for
I realise
time,
that, but
so
let me give you some very simple examples of where yes, there can be problems with consumer lending. We know that. It is for the FCA to deal with that. So let me give you two examples. You have a young musician, a talented musician, who needs a very expensive musical instrument. Why is it contrary to policy in Scots law for that young musician to be able to raise a loan secured over that very valuable musical instrument? It would facilitate his career, and it is quite probably the only way in which his career can be thus facilitated. As a slightly more highfalutin and less sympathetic or empathetic example, somebody around this room wants to go and buy an expensive painting, hasn't got the money to do it. Why is it contrary to public policy for that person to be allowed to borrow money secured over that painting which has a very real value? These are the reasons we felt that consumers should be in it. That consumers in certain circumstances need protection, we do not for a minute doubt, and we put some protections in the bill. There are limits to what consumers can grant security over, but nevertheless, in consumer credit, the protections come not from what type of product is available, but from how the FCA regulate your conduct in relation to that product.
Okay.
all right. I think Richard Lyle very briefly, and then we'll.
Yeah. Basically, what you're suggesting will bring in a new transaction in Scotland. If this was introduced, is there anything to stop a company lending on equipment, doing an asset swap with another company? And do you see this possibly being traded on the stock market or financial markets? Yes or no? Simple, quick answer.
Who would like to answer that?
Can I understand your question? What do you mean by asset swap?
You're bringing in a new transaction. You're basically bringing in a new system. It's not in Scotland now that you have suggested all this morning. So basically, if we bring it in, if I as a company give you a loan on your equipment, can I then asset swap that to another company? Yes or no?
Well, the equipment is mine, so therefore I'm the person that can.
But I've given you the loan.
Equipment. Sorry, you've got.
I've given you the loan, so can I give that? Can I sell that loan to another company?
Can you trade the loan?
Yeah, can I trade it?
Well, that's not within the ambit of the bill.
Right, that's okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
You've answered that. So, what is your view on? You basically put forward this morning. You believe this bill will unlock finance and make Scotland open for business. The Scottish Government has not committed to bring in this bill forward in this parliamentary session. What's your view on that fact?
Andrew?
I have to say, confess, I didn't follow the question on this occasion, Mr. Lyle. Could you repeat the question?
Okay. The Scottish Government has not committed to bring the bill forward in this parliamentary session. And what you've put forward this morning is that you believe this bill would unlock finance and make Scotland more open for business. So what is your view on the fact that the Government's not committed to bring forward the bill and wants to consult more?
I think all of us except Dr. Stephen can probably give a view on this, because I think the Scottish Law Commission is circumscribed in how it can comment on what the Scottish Government does or does not do. I think the view of the four of us here, and Professor Gretton is probably free to comment as well, being ex-Commission, is that we've made very clear, I think, that we believe this is an essential reform for business and for making Scotland a place in which you can do business. That Scotland is one of the best places in the world to do business, this is an essential part of that if that is what you want to achieve. I don't think we can then tell the Scottish Government politically how it has to balance the needs of business against the needs of reform of the law for families, the needs of the reform of the law in the criminal side. We cannot say that. What we can say is, if you are interested in helping business advance, and in Scotland being the best place in the world to do business, this is an essential part of that. The rest, where that goes from there, is with respect for MSPs and the Scottish Government to decide what they can deliver. Is that a fair comment, chaps?
Nodding heads. In terms of the bill, what would be the next steps, or is the view from our witnesses that the work has been done to actually implement this, and subject to, for example, removing certain provisions if it were the view were taken that, given all the different considerations that have been mentioned, it might be wise at this stage to simply take out the provisions that relate to individual consumers and simply restrict the bill's effect to those trading as a business or businesses. Is there anything else that needs to be done at this stage before the bill could be progressed with on that or another basis, if there were the political will or a decision were taken that this could be done in terms of the other priorities and pressures that are placed on government and the Parliament?
The Scottish Government is undertaking a targeted consultation at the moment, and I'm going to be a glass half full person, which is not always what I am, but in the legislative programme for last year, the government announced its defamation consultation. And then in this year's legislative programme, the defamation bill is within that. This time, the government have announced the consultation on this bill. So I'm going to be optimistic and hope that it will appear in next year's legislative programme. In terms of detail, there may be issues in which the current targeted government consultation brings up things which the government may wish to adjust, but
so my question is not so much what the government, might want to do. It's more whether or not, from your point of view, having considered the matter, there's anything specific that you think needs to be done. As you say, the government's doing a particular consultation, and the government or the Parliament has its own priorities or views on things. There's political realities as well. But from the point of view of the panel, is there anything from stepping back from political or other considerations, looking at the law neutrally, that needs done?
I was hesitating because I was thinking of quoting a politician from elsewhere who's been using the phrase "oven ready" so much recently. Well. I would suggest that this bill is oven ready.
Right. Well, we will try and take that as a neutral intended comment rather than political in any sense. I think in that case, thank you. We'll simply close this particular portion of our session this morning. Thank you to all of our witnesses for coming in. I'll now suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session. Thank you for coming in.